Welcome to the 7th episode of Inside Illustration. This episode is part of the Illustration for Gaming season of Inside Illustration, a biannual suite of content brought to you by the Association of Illustrators. We are a UK-based organisation with members from all around the world who support illustrators across all areas of their professional lives, offering extensive business advice and a review of clients' contracts, as well as staging events, campaigning for illustrators' rights, and running the annual World Illustration Awards. Members of the AOI have exclusive access to the full range of content for Inside Illustration at theaoi.com/inside-illustration, where we have in-depth articles, a range of resources, and the opportunity for members to take part in an exclusive creative course on illustration for gaming. I'm your host, Rachel Emily Taylor, artist, writer and course leader of BA Illustration at Camberwell College of Arts. Gaming is a huge part of the entertainment industry, with new games appearing all the time, competing for players' attention, constantly reinventing what can be achieved technically and visually. Exciting challenges can be the focus of many games, but the emotional connection and exploration of responses to feelings is also a driver for stories that pose questions and encourage players to assess their reactions. The visuals are a significant element for any game, with the look and style of different titles ranging from the hyper-realistic to more quirky illustrative approaches. Across both of these, illustrators work as concept or user interface artists, creating environments, characters, creatures, and a whole range of game assets. Working as part of a team, game creation is a collaborative process, and problem solving and visual communication skills are important elements for illustrators to contribute to that process. In this session, we're talking to two guests who have worked together as part of a team and made significant contributions to the world of gaming, visually and more. Catherine Unger, art director, 2D game artist and illustrator, and creative director, designer, writer and artist at SFB Games, Adam Vian. Welcome. Catherine, can you tell us a bit about your background and experience in the gaming world?
Yes, so I'm an art director and 2D artist in games. I originally studied illustration and animation at uni, which is where I met Adam Vian. And I graduated around the time when games on phones was becoming more popular. So things like Angry Birds was around and stuff like that. And I think before I kind of graduated, video games looked a lot more three-dimensional. And so when I saw this kind of like boom of games that were now like 2D, I thought, okay, this is something I can do. And I also didn't enjoy animating that much. So I basically told Adam, who was already working on games at the time, I would like to get into games. So if you hear of anything, let me know. And then it kind of just started from there. And so basically now been like 14 years working in games. And now I'm working on my own secret game.
Fantastic. That kind of leads nicely into your introduction, Adam. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I grew up playing them in the 90s. We had a ZX Spectrum and a Mega Drive, and then eventually a PlayStation. And then with my brother Tom, as teenagers, we got into making games for the first time through the Flash scene. So for websites and browsers, we were making games using what was then known as Macromedia Flash. And we just did it as a fun hobby. No one was paying us to do it. It was just for fun. And we did that over and over again, and it very slowly, organically turned into a job as we got sponsorship deals and we needed to pay a composer and things like that. So for me, it was a very slow, natural process. There wasn't a point where it was like, this is going to be my job now. It was just something I've always wanted to do. So my first game that was notable was 2003, which was a platformer called Nightmare. The first game we ever made that needed money was a game called Blue Rabbit's Climate Chaos, where we literally realized as idiot teenagers, we need to pay the composer, so we're going to have to get money from somewhere because we had no money. We made a game called Detective Grimoire, which was a point-and-click murder mystery detective game. That was in 2007, and that was a very basic game inspired by the trends at the time, which was Ace Attorney and Professor Layton. We made a game called Haunt the House, which was another Flash game where you play as a little ghost floating around a haunted house. That was probably our most popular Flash game. People still email me to this day saying I used to play that in my computer room at school when I wasn't supposed to be doing such a thing. The first game I made with Catherine was called From Beyond, which was at a global game jam event, where you play as an ambivalent entity and you flick asteroids onto a planet and knock over animals. And Catherine recorded the noises for all the animals at 2 a.m.
Don't search it up.
It's an excellent game. And then we made a game called Haunt the House Terror Town, which is a sort of sequel to Haunt the House, which actually was a game we made with Sony for the Vita. That was an interesting time. And then we made a game called Detective Grimoire Secret of the Swamp, which was with Catherine. That was kind of a big project that we had, which is another point-and-click detective mystery adventure game that had a voice acting and it had a composed soundtrack. And that was a big step up for us as a career point, because suddenly we had all these irons in the fire. We've made small little iOS games, Rugby Golf, Launchosaurus, which we just kind of made and then you throw onto the iOS and you hope Apple's going to give you a feature. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And then we released a game called Snipper Clips in 2017, which Catherine worked on as well with me and a few other people, which was a Nintendo game. And that's a 2D physics puzzle game with a lot of illustration in it because it's all 2D assets. So that was a high point for sure. After that, we released a game called Tangle Tower, which was another mystery detective adventure game with Catherine. Again, lots of character animation and dialogue and puzzles and hand-painted backgrounds. And most recently, in May of 2024, I released a game called Crow Country, which is a PlayStation 1 style survival horror game set in an abandoned theme park. So that was a bit of a departure from our normal affair, but it's done well. So those are some of my games that you've heard of, or you could look them up.
So I've got some questions that I wanted to direct to both of you. So the first one, it's quite a good opener, but I was really interested about what games means to both of you. What does creating games mean?
The idea of working in games is like creating art that someone plays, which is both equally terrifying and very exciting. The idea that you would design a character or a world that someone can basically explore and like discover is the most rewarding experience, I think, as an artist, rather than looking at illustration, which is just kind of quite a static experience.
For me, it means I get to make stuff for a job, which is all I want to do. I just want to make stuff all day. And I'm very grateful that I have a job where I can do that. I think if I hadn't have done this, I might have ended up doing model making or something because I love creating tangible things, but I have no patience for, wood or anything like that. So I like making stuff in a digital space instead. And yeah, it just allows me to be infinitely creative, and that's what I like about it.
I know there's, from indie to AAA games, there's a huge range of aesthetic approaches which can range from traditional to surreal and experimental. Is that something the two of you kind of welcome, this sort of range of aesthetics?
The weirder the better, I think, with games. I think in indie games, they tend to be a bit more experimental because there's a lot less financial pressure. And also because there's smaller teams, more ideas hit the paper, basically. And I think there's a lot of untapped potential in games still. I still think it's a very young industry.
Yeah, I'm the same. I think we should be seeing even more weird, experimental, vibrant stuff. And I feel like I myself aren't even contributing to that as much as I'd like to be. I want to make more stuff that's really weird and strange and funny and unique and memorable, and not just like everything else that already exists. And the space to do that is there in video games.
That's really exciting. I'm sure all of our listeners will be really excited to hear that and ideas about how you can maybe break or boundaries or explore new territory. So thinking about that, what do you feel an illustrator can bring to a game?
I wish games were as brave and wacky as illustrations look, and I'd include animation in that as well. I feel like there's way more room to be creative, and I feel like that is something that is explored in illustration and animation. Like even when you see an illustration where the room is like flat and you can see all sides of the table, and like that's something that isn't really seen in games. It's very kind of like most of the time quite straight-laced visually. I guess thank goodness You're Here did some exciting stuff.
That's a good modern example, yeah.
Yeah, like there would be scenes where a character would change scale, like an animation, depending on what they decided to do. It was quite creative, but yeah.
My favorite example from the history of games where an illustrator has defined a game is Parappa the Rapper, which is the American illustrator Rodney Greenblatt working with a Japanese company. And his illustrations are so kind of simple and minimal and charming and sweet. You'd never expect to see it in a game, but they did it and it was completely new and people still talk about it today. And it's completely central to the identity of that game is his 2D illustrations.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So, like, more of that, please, basically.
Is it because I'm not familiar with that game, but is it that the aesthetic or the illustrations direct the kind of gameplay or the kind of rules in the game as well?
They actually affect the animation because the characters in that game are just flat pieces of paper that bend in a 3D space.
Oh, wow.
So they took his illustrations and just put them in the computer and animated them as they were. And it created something completely unique. And even to this day, it's unique.
Yeah.
But it's just such a great example of, okay, just find a really cool illustrator and just put their work in a game. And you probably will get something that doesn't look like the other games that are already out there.
I also think Parappa the Rapper has now gone full circle and started inspiring illustrators.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's almost like creating this atmosphere or these different type of characters. I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there any other sort of game or examples like that you can think of?
I've wrote a couple down. They're all Japanese illustrators because the area that I'm most interested, well, the area where this comes up the most is rhythm games, which is what Parappa the Rapper is, funnily enough. And there's a couple more examples. There's a game called Gitaru Man, which is completely based on the illustration of Mitsuru Nakamura. And if you look that game up, all the key art, which is like a promotional art, and the box art and everything, is his hand-painted illustrations. So they don't even use the 3D models to promote the game. They use the hand-painted stuff, which is so nice. And you don't see it as much anymore. The other example is from Nintendo, and it's Ko Takeuchi and his illustrations that form the basis of Rhythm Heaven and WarioWare, both those games. And his style is very comedic and punchy and kind of stupid and makes you laugh, but it's all 2D hand-drawn illustration. And it's what the game is made out of. And it's so great. And I wish I had 100 more examples for you, really.
What other qualities do you think an illustrator can bring? Is it interest in detail, being patient or adaptable?
I think being able to collaborate and communicate with your team, as games are mostly made by many. And like, I guess in illustration, you kind of have feedback loops that are kind of slow, but in games, it's way more regular. So you kind of need to be used to being adaptable in that sense.
I think you need to develop a sense of how to convey meaning and information with your work in 1 second. So you need to make stuff that is, when the player glances at it, they get what they need to get from it and they don't get confused. You want to make it appealing, but you also want to make it immediately useful as well, which is something you learn as you do it.
Would you also say you can't be computer shy?
Sure.
I mean, there are outliers where there are games that, like, made of clay or
It does happen.
stop motion, but it's normally that you would be headhunted for that role rather than you having a generalist career.
The best kind of person is someone who's happy to jump between Photoshop and Unity and Unreal and everything else, and you would just happily use them all. Really.
Yeah. But, you know, you can also learn this stuff on an internship.
I mean, games take a long time to make, and there's always points in that development where it's too much work, it's taking too long.
Yeah.
You really have to be someone that learns to trust the process. Every game I've ever made, there's been blocks of time where I've hated it and hated myself and wanted to quit. And so you really have to be patient and you have to just stick with it and keep going and hope for the best.
This is a lot easier for me to say working for you as an artist.
Right.
But don't look up the mountain, basically, of work that you need to do, because as soon as you do that, it becomes very demoralizing, even if it's fun work.
Yeah.
Because you know you have to create all of that work at some point. And it's better to kind of look at what you've done as you go on rather than what's ahead of you.
Yeah, you have to learn to be pragmatic and just make to-do lists and just do something every day. And then one day, oh, I'm done. I'm finally done. It's,
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
Whereas you as a director, which I'm learning now, you have to look ahead and all the time to make sure that you can still make the game and that in case you need to cut stuff as well.
Yeah, it's quite stressful to be thinking about, oh, the next year of my time has to be used in this exact way and I could fall behind. And it's a stressful medium to make a game for sure.
I was getting this sense of, you know, wonder that can be important asset for a game. How much do you think the visuals contribute to that? And I guess that's building on what we've just saying, but how much does the visuals add to that sense of wonder for a game?
I think initially in that first second, the visuals are contributing 100%. And then as you spend more time looking at it, playing it, whatever, it starts to be spread out between the music and the writing and the controls and everything else. But there's no getting away from the fact that in that first second, the visuals are everything. And if you've got something that catches people's eye and makes them go, whoa, what's this? It's the illustration, it's the visuals, it's the character design, it's the color choices.
It's part of the entertainment factor, I think, the visual design. It's in the same way that sound contributes to like the way it feels. There is the game design, which is the, like, how would you describe game design?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that will take a minute to understand. The audience perspective, they're not going to understand the game design until they've maybe seen a video of the gameplay and they go, oh, okay, you jump and you punch or you roll down a hill, whatever it is. But you can see the joy of the visuals, in 1 second.
Yeah, and it communicates the design as well. So
if it's doing its job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I was thinking as well, about both of your experience working in games, and there's this sense of being collaborative. How closely does the artist or illustrator need to understand the other roles like writer, game designer, creative director? Is there any crossover?
So for me, in my experience, I've only ever worked in what would be considered very small teams. Mm-hmm. The biggest team I've ever worked on is 7 people, which in the industry standard is tiny. And we go all the way down to 2 people. So for me, it's all crossover all the time. And I wear a lot of hats. And if I'm being an artist, I also might be a writer and a developer and a designer and a director as well. So in my experience, you have people that are doing all these things and just learn on the job. But in bigger companies, which I can't really speak on because I haven't done that myself, you would be more compartmentalized. There are AAA games made by 200 people, and there'll be a team of concept artists, and they probably don't get to contribute that much in, say, the game design. But who's to say? I don't know.
Yeah, I think with large companies, you have the department leads that would kind of talk to each other. But then as you drill down, like you said, in indie games, the roles start blurring. And in every case, in every game, the different roles need to speak to each other in order to inform like the whole game, basically.
Like when you first worked with me, it was supposed to be illustration, art, asset creation.
Just drawing.
But inescapably, that is storytelling. So what you end up doing is getting involved in writing the story. Or it happens with my composer. Like they end up writing the story with me because the music is the story as well. So there's really no getting away from, you end up contributing to a game's world and story and everything.
That's why game credits are a bit complicated, because you can say, oh, the artist did this, but in indie games, it's normally the case that people contribute to many parts of a game, just in one conversation.
Is that why you've both been quite interested in working within indie games? Is this kind of crossover?
Yeah, I mean, we just like working on stuff where we get to have control, I think.
It's definitely more fun because I think, like I said, I didn't really enjoy animation that much because it was so linear. But in games, the variety is so interesting. One day I could be working on drawing something, the next day I could be writing with you.
It's almost like moving into an art director role. So you were working within the art director role from being an illustrator. Can you talk to us a bit about how you made that transition?
To art director?
Yes, yeah.
Kept working and eventually got hired to work as an art director. It's like kind of like a ladder.
So building up that experience.
Yes, yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about the collaboration on the game Gibbon and, maybe how the team worked together?
So working on Gibbon, we had to create these parallaxes that required me to work with game artists and tech artists in order to make it feel 3D. And part of that process was we decided to basically make the tree canopies 3D. And instead of 3D modeling them, the tech artist basically did a magic trick. I can't tell you how he did it. But basically, when you draw out a sprite basically being a 2D art asset, when you put it in the game, it would basically create a 3D object of that sprite by kind of like creating a bulge in the 3D mesh.
Like bump mapping.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something, tech artists is a whole thing that illustrators would find very exciting coming into the game industry, because they can create very easy solutions to make games beautiful and mean that you basically don't have to do as much work.
When you were both working together on your games, what was that time frame like? So for the process from concept to completion, is it quite long or?
So I've lived on both sides of this. When I was making Flash games for browsers, which is what I started doing, a small project was 2 days in its entirety.
Wow.
And a large project was a month. Now, a small project is 2 years and a large project is 4 years. And some games take 10 years to make, but we don't talk about those ones.
Yeah. Yeah, like the first game we made together was From Beyond, technically.
That was a game jam game.
Yeah.
So that was an event we went to where you're supposed to make a game in, say, 48 hours. So you sit there and do it and you don't really sleep. And once you hit 30, you can't do that anymore. So you stop.
Because you need to sleep. Yeah, but so that game was made in 48 hours. But now the games we're working on, take like 4 or 5 years.
I wish they didn't.
I wish they didn't.
That's one downside of games, is it can take a long time compared to some other art forms, for sure. And you always start by saying to yourself, oh, we're going to make a game that we can complete in a year, but it's pretty unrealistic.
Wondering about that, if it takes so long, how do you financially support it?
Well, that's a very good question. A lot of people in the industry are struggling with this right now, trying to get funding and sponsorship and publishing. For me, my journey was make small stuff for free and get slightly bigger every time until you build up this kind of momentum of, well, we can afford to make the next thing because we're selling the previous thing already. So yeah, we've made a lot of games and we sell them, and maybe they don't sell massive numbers, but if you're selling 5 games and each one is selling a couple of copies a day, you get what's called a long tail, where you have something resembling an income just neutrally. And that's how we get by even without big companies giving us funding. But that's a very lucky position to be in. Not everyone's in that position.
And I was wondering, because you both worked together on Tangle Tower, how did that come about?
So as I said earlier, we got talking after university about me wanting to work in games. And around 6 months after we had that conversation, I mean, that's very specific, Adam messaged me on Facebook and was like, I need some backgrounds for our next Detective Grimoire game. And I was just like, me? Can I?
Yeah, so it was a process of me making these games and wanting them to get better and better, but not having all the skills myself. I liked drawing characters, but I wasn't very good at background painting. And so I just finished uni and I was like, who would be the best at this? It's Catherine, and she's my friend, so I'll hire her. And that's how it goes down. And going to uni and making those connections is very valuable because you meet all these talented people that you can then hire later. So yeah, before Tangle Tower, we made a game called Detective Grimoire, Secret of the Swamp. And then we just sort of never stopped working together. I'd never let Catherine wander off too far after that. So we made Tangle Tower. And by that point, you'd come on board kind of as helping me with the story and all the character designs and pretty much everything.
So my role on the Grimoire series in particular has kind of evolved over the years.
And how much is the player in mind when you're working on the visuals? Like, how much are you thinking of what the audience will see or the player?
So for me, I think I'm trying to keep the player in mind all the time, no matter what you're working on, because you need to put yourself in their shoes and think, okay, what are they seeing? What are they thinking? What are they going to be thinking in a minute? Are they going to be misled or confused? What are they going to be looking at? That's kind of the secret to game design, is to kind of put yourself in the mind of a player all the time. I think I'm doing that all the time. At this point, I think maybe it's become second nature. So I hope I'm doing it all the time. But I'm also thinking of myself, and I want to please myself and my own tastes. So I'm just kind of making stuff that I think looks cool. And at this point in my career, I feel like I can get away with trusting my own tastes, as it were, because I've been through enough projects. And what do you think?
I agree with you that you think about it from the moment you start drawing the first drawing. Even with like Tangle Tower specifically, my job was to draw illustrated backgrounds that you then click on to find clues. And you couldn't just draw a single illustration. You had to think about, is this object visible enough for the player to see? And is it also not too obvious? And another thing that you have to think about is quite technical, where you're thinking about what you're going to play it on. So, for example, if it's on an iPhone, which is probably less so the case nowadays, but back in the day, when you played a game on iPhone, you would have to make sure that the object was big enough for you to click on and wasn't fiddly.
Yeah, you have to think about the size of your finger on the screen and all these technical things.
Yeah.
And the other thing you've got to do is make sure you don't draw anything that's too interesting if it's not part of the game design, because then the player will be distracted. So you have to think about all these things all the time.
What you want them to look at.
Exactly.
What the focus of attention is. So there's a large gaming community. Do their opinions have any influence on the creation of games?
Well, like any entertainment business, they are the buyers. So they will have an influence on what comes out, especially in terms of funding. If a game becomes popular, there's most likely going to be a lot more clones of that game. And so it does mean that there are less interesting games as a whole, but then you get these outliers. And usually that will be because there is someone who has made the game for free on their own, or in an indie sense, they funded it themselves. Maybe I'm making a sweeping statement.
I think for me, when I think about am I influenced by, the audience and their perception and their opinion? I am in small ways. Like I'll certainly be on the lookout for feedback on granular stuff, controls or options or quality of life stuff. But the broad strokes, I'm just making stuff I want to make to please myself, like you say. So I try not to think about what the audience wants too much.
Oh, yeah. On an individual level, I try and draw what I want to draw.
It usually gets the best results if you're making something, that you want to make.
Yeah, make something you love, basically.
I think that's good advice. Have you had any interesting challenges thrown up? And what issues have happened that you might advise others to avoid?
Yeah, when I think about challenges in my career, there's a couple of projects that went awry. And we made a game called Phantom Pharaoh's Treasure Trap for Adult Swim. And you can't find it anymore. But it was on the internet for a while. And the big lesson there was we went into animation and character illustration and everything too soon. And we put too much time making polished asset work when the base of the game wasn't tight enough. So the big takeaway, and I've learned this lesson a couple of times, is, if you're actually on the game design side of things, make sure you're prototyping something to be fun and functional before you spend money and time doing too much polished artwork. Because it's one thing to do concept art, but then when you actually start animating and doing final assets, that can put you in a hole where you suddenly can't change anything because you put too much time and money into, the character looks like this, they animate like this, and then suddenly you're stuck and you feel like you can't throw anything out. So yeah, the big lesson there was prototype more sooner. And that's happened to me a couple of times.
I like that game.
It's got good animation.
Yeah, I think for me, I still struggle with this. And it's the idea of letting go of ideas. And when you start working on a game, you tend to come up with loads of different ideas, like a huge range of concept art. And I think at some point, you're not going to use all those ideas. And I can get very attached. And it pays to be quite flexible, I think, in games and look at the bigger picture. Because oftentimes the details that you're getting caught up in, a player wouldn't notice or care about. It's good to kind of be good at being flexible, basically.
Another one that I would have that's kind of related to that is about taking feedback. So if you're making a game that's your baby and you're the director or the writer or whatever, and you get some feedback that you don't agree with, in my experience, there's been times when I've been like, I'm just going to dismiss that because they don't understand that it's wrong. And then you carry on. But what quite often happens is a week later, I found myself agreeing with it. And I just needed to rest and sleep and calm down and then come around to seeing something. And that's happened a few times now where I've tried to learn, don't assume you're right and let people tell you that they...
We just need to chill our egos out, basically.
Yeah, it happens a little bit every project, I think.
So my next question is about how gaming is being impacted by AI. I'm sure you've both got a lot to say on that, but do you have any thoughts or suggestions about how this might impact the industry?
I think it's going to impact the less art-focused side of the industry. I would hope that games are being made where the art and the illustration is being put front and center, and you've got stuff that's distinct and striking and unique and handmade. That is kind of immune from the AI problem. But then on the other side, you've got stuff that's being made that's just kind of content to make money, deliberately looking like stuff that's already out there, which is what AI is. It's let's gather up everything that's been made, put it in a blender and get it back out again and then sell it. Whereas if you've got something that stands on its own, then you're kind of immune to that, I hope.
Yeah, I think that's why it does pay to be original in this respect.
I guess going back to what you were saying at the start about making things weirder and pushing boundaries, maybe that can't be done by AI.
It will never be. AI is only ever going to be the average point of pre-existing work. So you're never going to find something that makes you surprised or unnerved.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen.
I feel weirdly not worried about it. Maybe that's wrong, but I feel like there's no AI that can come up with a brand new Parappa the Rapper, for example.
The day AI comes up with a game that is more interesting than a human, it just hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it ever will, because it just can't. So,
famous last word.
Come back to me in a few years. Yeah.
I like that answer. So I know there's lots of conversations on representation in gaming, particularly with characters and stereotypical characters or gender. Do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I feel like the industry is working to steer away from gender stereotypes. Like there's been a lot of main characters in games that are not prescribing to the kind of generic man, basically. But I think it's a complicated issue to talk about, and I don't want to open a can of worms. But there is like a section of the gaming audience that are not ready for that change. And obviously they are the consumer. So it is complicated.
I think we're at a really interesting point in this discussion because on one hand, it feels like the problem has been solved. Because this year's E3 summer season of trailers, I sat and watched them all, all these new games coming out. And non-sexualized female protagonists are everywhere now. They are almost standard, which is great. But at the same time, there's this really tedious culture war going on where people are more incensed than ever in certain shadowy communities about certain character designs and what clothes they're wearing and these kind of things. And
yeah, it seems to get focused on
I think that the trick is to just not feed into the argument one way or the other and just make great, interesting, memorable characters. I will say for me, it's like I want to see more women characters that are stupid and silly and useless and strange and funny. I don't always want it to be, the answer to the overly sexualized female character is the tough, no-nonsense female character. It's starting to happen, I think.
Yeah.
But it's, it's easy to go too boring on the other side as well.
More variety.
Yeah, let the women characters be as weird as the men characters is one thing. Like quite often you'll have, I don't like it when I see a group of, say, like, there's 5 characters and they're all wacky shapes and sizes, and then the girl one is just girl-shaped. And even Pixar and Disney, they still do this.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's come on.
You'll get the guy with the bulbous nose, but then the lady looks like Barbie.
Well, like Inside Out, where it's like, they're all different shapes, but the girls kind of just look like girls, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, come on.
So it can be pushed a bit more variety.
Yeah.
Yes.
Catherine, so you've created a whole range of environments, 1960s Antarctica and south of the Circle, and wilderness and townscapes in Gibbon Beyond the Trees. When you're world building, there must be loads of interesting research. How do you go about doing this?
The computer, the internet. I that would be the boring answer. Yeah. I think boringly, a lot of research is done browsing the web. But I do try and look at books because that's where you find the unexpected. Sometimes I'll join a project and the research has already been done for me. So, for example, on South of the Circle, my director had gone on a trip to Antarctica, and he also had relatives who had gone to Antarctica and taken photos in like the 1960s. And then on Gibbon, for example, we were actually going to go to Borneo to go see gibbons, but the pandemic hit, so it didn't happen. So we resorted to Google Maps and to look at the Borneo streets to get inspiration.
So lots of like site visits, whether that is through Google Maps or like physically going to places. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think on Tangle Tower, this wasn't a trip that I meant to go on for the project, but I was very inspired by the Pitts Rivers Museum. And I remember seeing this puffer lamp and I wholesale stole that and put it in the game.
How do you feel that you've developed as an illustrator within gaming?
I feel like I'm much more confident as an artist now I've started working in games. I think with illustration, I'd get a bit of stage fright because you have to work to a brief, you kind of get a few sketch rounds and then suddenly, boom, you've done an illustration, it's in context, it'll be on a website or in a magazine. And I think with games, there's a long iteration process where you get time to edit that for quite a long time before it's final. And so it's kind of made me approach drawing in a more relaxed way. And I think that now I've brought that back into my own personal illustration that has become a bit more loose because I'm like, well, I can always change it later when I can't. But it's given me that kind of mindset now.
Right. Adam, I've got some questions for you. Crow Country is a big shift in visuals from previous games like Snipper Clips and Marching Order. What was involved in that decision?
It's a very self-indulgent distraction, I have to admit. I grew up playing PlayStation 1 games, and as an adult, I collect them and I spend a lot of time playing them. And I just realized, these sort of early 3D survival horror games are such a wonderful subgenre. And I love them, and they're still fun today, and I just want to make my own. And it kind of collided with a moment in time where I had just gained access to some rudimentary 3D tools. So it's a software thing as well. We learnt Unity for Snipper Clips. And I suddenly had the ability to model some basic stuff. Like you say, we'd done 2D before, and I just thought, I can make some little basic models. So yeah, I just wanted to try it. And it was a full-on hobby project for fun that I made. And it just evolved into a real game.
Yeah, so that kind of aesthetic, I guess you're saying there's a sense of nostalgia to that. So it was nostalgia and the software that prompted that new aesthetic for Crow Country?
Yes, it was very nostalgically driven, for sure. It's not exactly pushing the envelope. It's more going back and seeing if there's anything left in an older envelope. But I had great fun making it. Unusual in that I was the only artist on the project, because normally I work with Catherine or an animator or whatever. And this time I just modeled everything myself. And it was that ultimate fantasy of just building a little shoebox world in your garage, I'm just going to make this by myself. And it's lovely. I really enjoyed it.
Could you say a little bit more about the modelling?
Yeah, it's most comparable to making stuff out of clay, because everything in Crow Country starts off as a cube in the game. I generate a cube, and then I start squishing it and bending it and pulling the corners apart and things like that. So it really does feel like I've sort of got this tangible process. And the trick to modeling for me is to look at it through the game camera the whole time. So you're not looking at it from the perspective of this isolated asset. You're looking at it from the camera angle that the player will see it at. And that's been my trick, is to make assets that are appealing and have the right detail hierarchy, because there's nothing worse than something that's too detailed and too small. There's a kind of rule is things have to have an equivalent level of detail across the whole image, which is true for illustration as well. But yeah.
And the game, it has like a non-combat explorer mode. Is that for people who just want to soak up the world, the visuals, the atmosphere?
I've never thought about it in those terms. I would hope that everybody is soaking up the visuals and the atmosphere, regardless of whether or not they're shooting the guns or not. The reason that's in there is I saw a tweet years ago where somebody said, does anyone know if there's a modification for Silent Hill, which is another survival horror game, that takes away the monsters? Because, and I quote, I just love being there, but I don't want to kill anything. And that stuck with me for years. And I was like, that's such a nice sentiment. You just want to be in the game world and just enjoy being there. So when I made my own, I was like, I'm just going to have a button that turns them off. And then it means that people who, for whatever reason, have decided they're not going to play horror games or can't play them, they can play Crow Country as well.
I really appreciate that, because I can't play Last of Us 2 the whole way through because I'm too scared.
Yeah.
I've got a question for both of you. What do you feel are the main points to consider when creating samples for gaming focused on the illustrator's portfolio?
So imagining looking at a portfolio, I want to see evidence that you could take an idea all the way through to some kind of polished final asset, because that's a really important part of the process, right? It's that step of sketch, clean up sketch, final asset, something like that.
So kind of like in the portfolio, you'd want to see a range of sketches, taking it forward, maybe exploring it in the designs in 3D.
Yep, and then polishing and layouts, maybe in a fake screenshot or something, to show that you understand where your art is going to go in a game's space.
I was literally going to say that, show your art in situ and take away the job of the art director imagining your work in a game, and just go straight in there and just make a fake game screenshot or even a fake game animation. And it helps the director basically bridge that gap, rather than thinking that your art can be in a game, you should show it. I also think when you're showing concept art in a portfolio, it's a good idea to show how many ways you can come up with one idea, or on one subject. For example, if you're designing an old man character, how much variety in terms of idea generating can you explore? And I think that's a very good sign for an art director, to show that you have imagination and range.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So in my teaching with students, it's always encouraging them to see, not just to rush for the final form or just to keep developing it and doing different iterations. So I guess that would be important as well in a portfolio if an illustrator was looking at games, so developing different characters.
Yeah, you want to see the skill of development, and you want to see their thought process, really, because that's the intelligence to go through that process, and to see the steps on the page is what you're looking for. We talked about, mock up a fake screenshot to show your work in situ. I want to go one step further and say the best thing that really turns the wheels in this, even in the indie industry, is what if there was an actual game that you could point to and say, hey, I did the work for this game.
Yeah.
And even if it's a tiny game that you've made by yourself or with a couple of friends, just being able to point to something that you've seen to the end of the process and upload it somewhere online, that is pretty much the most important thing and that's what you hear people talk about is, oh, this person, they did the art on this thing. And then you just go look up that game and you never even necessarily look at a portfolio. You just look at a finished product. So my advice would be make tiny games and upload them. And there's a website called itch.io where you can upload games very easily, even without, doing any kind of admin.
And they can make tiny games using Playmaker or Unity, right?
Yeah, there's tools you can use to do them, even if you're not like a hardcore programmer. But just having something to point to and said, I made this, that's the best possible thing you can have in your portfolio.
That's great advice. I've got some questions for the business side. How do game producers generally source artists for their productions?
Usually it's the creative director or the art director that is looking for the hires. In most cases, the first step is to go via recommendation, which isn't that helpful for anyone new coming into the industry. However, those recommendations, more often than not, are booked and are not available. So
What do you mean?
Like they'll be on other projects or they're working full time.
Oh, they're busy.
The next stage is to do either kind of like reach out further within your network or to do a call out on social media, and that is an open call out. So anyone could send their portfolio in to that art director.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. In my experience, it's you hire your friends or you hire someone that your friend is going to recommend. So the advice would be one of those people somehow. Get your work seen by people, have all these connections, get your work out there. There was a really amusing trend of we needed to hire a 3D artist. And there were a handful of 3D artists that had done 3D fan art of Catherine's own illustrations. And they were on our radar because of that.
Yeah, they basically already nailed the interview by doing that. Yeah.
That's one way to do it.
I know you mentioned game jams earlier. Is that something you'd recommend to kind of meet people?
Absolutely, because then you meet developers who are making games and they'll know developers most likely more often than not. I also think for portfolio reasons, it's a great thing to do. So if you're an illustrator, you can go down to a game jam and basically say, hey, I can make art. Does anyone need art in their game? And by the end of 48 hours where you haven't slept, you're more likely to have a portfolio piece, essentially, with your art in a game.
Yeah, it's great advice. And people have met, teammates in such a setting. There's online game jams all the time and they're fine, but nothing beats, going to like a warehouse somewhere and forming a team impromptu with like-minded peers. It's really great if you can do it.
We're making it sound grueling, but it's really fun.
It is fun.
It's incredibly enjoyable and creative.
I've got good memories of doing that.
How are the visual roles in gaming structured in terms of employment? I'm assuming for indie games, it's mainly freelance?
In indie games, and I'll speak about indie games specifically because I've only ever worked in that, you do have in-house artists as well as freelance artists. My first job in games started as an internship, and that's a good place to start. And then it kind of led into an in-house job, which lasted 3 years. Well, didn't last 3 years. I stayed there for 3 years.
Yeah, it's all freelance on my end. Like my company's officially only 2 people, and then everybody on top of that is freelance. And that's how we do it. And generally, game projects, they can take a few years, and then you might not necessarily have the next one lined up immediately. So freelance has been the way to do it, where someone will come on board, do a year of work, go away for a year, do different work. And, there are games companies where you get a permanent job and you're expected to work on projects back to back. But in recent years, a lot of those small to medium-sized companies have been in big trouble because they've been losing all their funding and people are being laid off by parent companies, and it's a bit of a tricky point.
Your answers were making me think. I wanted to ask Catherine, what's the flexibility like when working for another game company?
In what respect?
Just like, could you do 2 jobs at once? Is it flexible in terms of your commitment? Or
I think when you sign up to work on a game contract, you're essentially promising yourself to that game and that you should fulfill that promise. If you have, say, there has been occasions where I receive a commission for concept art that may take me like 5 days. Usually there's quite a good negotiation process where I can be like, well, this is my commitment. I'm working on this game full time. However, if you could have this artwork in 5 months, or that's a long time, but like 1 day a month. But like, if you could have this artwork in the future, then I can definitely make it happen. And usually within indie games, that's okay, but sometimes there are contracts that don't allow you to do that. It depends on the employer.
And then thinking about that and the timescales, I mean, we were talking a bit about how long and short games can take, but for, say, an illustrator or artist, what would you say the timescale for the involvement in the game is?
It can be 3 days of doing concept art, or it can be 3 years, basically. And if you're freelancing and you have the option to choose, then you can kind of choose what you want to work on and when. So there was a period recently where I was lucky enough to have a gap in my schedule, and I was able to still fill that with small gigs.
So as someone who's been on many projects from start to finish, normally if there's illustration going on, it might be the first 50, 60% of the project and then no more. So, you've got concept art, and then you've got character design, and you've got asset creation, you've got backgrounds and everything else. But there's always a block of time. And sometimes that block of time can be very long. And on the back end of a project where it's just tech and publishing and QA and all the boring stuff. And usually the artist runs out of things to do. So, in our experience, you'll have gone up and you're doing something else by that point.
I Irish exit before the end of each project.
Yeah.
With more high-profile clients or platforms that you're working with, do they have budgets that reflect that sort of status when you're working with them?
They should do. I mean, we worked with a couple of higher-profile companies, I guess, and
You'd hope so, basically. But sometimes there are scenarios where the budget doesn't quite match the profile. It also depends on the size of the company, which makes it sound like the bigger companies have more money. Sometimes the smaller companies have had a really big game release and they'll have loads of money because they haven't employed loads of people. So it depends on the outgoings as well.
Even at a big company or a small company, the biggest factor that affects how much money you can ask for is your experience level. If you're a known expert who's done multiple things in that area, to completion well, you can ask for quite a bit. And if you're an expert in a niche field, you can ask for even more. So that's the biggest factor of how much money might be coming your way on an illustration game contract, I would say.
How do those interested in this area get contacts? I mean, we were talking about gaming jams, but is networking valuable?
Yeah, for sure. They say the best way to network is to not think about it as networking, just actually make friends in that space. So, if you've been to university, you've done that. And then going to events, expos and GDC and Brighton Develop, EGX, Comic-Cons, whatever there is, go there, chat to the developers, make friends, make contacts. You might meet some industry people. Yeah, there's an event every year in Brighton called Develop, and it's the biggest one in the UK now, where everyone's just kind of there for a week, and you have lots of high-powered meetings, but you also have a lot of just impromptu bumping into so-and-so and being recommended this person or that person.
Yeah, it's definitely worth going down to these events just to kind of meet people and become a recognizable face. I think it works better in your favor to just make friends with people rather than throwing your business card everywhere, but that also works too. I think I had advice at uni once that said, don't make friends, but it's the best thing I did because we made friends. And
Friends are your most valuable asset.
Yeah. I think another way to network is also following as many people as you can on social media, as murky as social media is right now. Because I think as soon as you're following game developers and game designers, game artists, especially with it near your town or in your town, then you start to hear about the events that are posted, mentorships that are posted, the kind of games they're playing. And I think it's good to immerse yourself in those communities to kind of see where everyone's going to be as well.
As a takeaway for our listeners, do you both have 3 things that are useful for illustrators keen to get into games to know?
My 3 takeaways would be to make art that looks like it could already be in a game, which we've mentioned earlier. I think secondly, don't draw orcs, or at least don't draw orcs that look like all the other orcs. Try and stand out and be unique, and don't try and fit in terms of like drawing game art assets. And I think be patient as well when you are trying to get into the industry. I think every story I've heard from my peers about how they got into the industry has been different. So I think that you should always keep trying because you're version of getting into the industry might be different as well.
Yeah, my first one is very, very general. And it's just when I think about all the biggest jobs I've had and all the best connections I've made, it's just because I was in the right place at the right time. So what that means as a piece of advice is put yourself in those places, make stuff, go to events, make yourself known to the general public, put stuff online, make connections, and just let those moments happen. Because there's a small handful of moments in my career where everything has changed because I bumped into so-and-so. And you just have to make that a possibility. My second one is very much what Catherine just said, which is try and make stuff that stands out. Like, don't just make illustration that looks like League of Legends or Overwatch or Fire Emblem or any game that already has 100 clones. And make stuff that forces people to stop in their tracks and go, oh, look at this. What's this? I want to know more, which is good for any art practice. And then the third one is a technical one. And it's just spend the time to learn Unity or Unreal game engine programs and just get started, get stuck in. And as we said before, just start making something. Even if you don't know what you're doing, a year down the line, suddenly you just will, and you'll have something to show. So yeah, just get stuck in with the programs and start making stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. For more information on terms and conditions and licensing and contracts, AOI members can check out our website for resources on a huge range of topics, plus access to the pricing calculator tool, which assists in working out fee levels for quotes and 2024's pricing survey. Members can also learn more about the roles within gaming for visual arts in our How to Get Into Gaming publication and an in-depth article available through Inside Illustration. There were also lots of free resources for all illustrators to access. Previous episodes of Inside Illustration are also available, with top guests providing loads of practical information on the illustration world across a whole range of areas, from children's books to fashion. Do give them a listen, and thank you for listening.